Welcome to another podcast series of Sustainable Futures podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Simone Sandholz, who's a senior scientist from United Nations University Institute for Environmental and Human Security, also called as UNU-EHS. Dr. Simone holds a PhD in geography, a master's degree in natural resource management, and a diploma in architecture and urban planning. In her research, Dr. Sandholz focuses on different aspects of future-oriented vulnerabilities and risk reduction with a focus on urban areas. Her two particular fields of expertise are resilient urban and regional development with an emphasis on critical infrastructure and nature-based solutions for risk reduction and climate change adaptation. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Simone.
Hello, and I'm super happy to be here.
To start with, Dr. Simone, could you tell us a little bit, where are you located? Which city, which place in the world are you right now?
That's a very good question because you already mentioned I'm with the United Nations. So we're
Yeah.
based in many different countries. Personally, I am based in Bonn in Germany. So also UNU, our United Nations University, we're having different offices worldwide. Our headquarters with directors located in Tokyo, but our institute is based in Bonn on the UN campus.
And what's your hometown?
I'm actually not even from a town. I'm a village girl, so to say, and I was born and raised in Germany, not even too far away from here, like 100 kilometers, but it's a village of 800 people.
Nice. Must have been great growing up in a small village in Germany.
Absolutely, roaming around a lot in the forest in the vicinities and looking after also my sister and cousins and so on.
Did you pick up something about sustainability? Was it part of your growing up?
I think it's part of the growing up of pretty much everyone, and you just embrace nature and love being somewhere around where it's looking nice. And even if I was growing up in the village, of course, there were towns and in the vicinities. And I think as a kid, you're having like a natural feeling which places you like and which places you like to go to.
Nice. That's really amazing because I also grew up in a village in Himalayas, and that has been a very defining factor in starting Earth5R.
Can
Uh,
imagine.
Yes, Simon, could you tell us a bit about UNU, United Nations University, and what it does? Because a lot of people would like to know, and not many people are aware about this particular organization.
Very happy to do so. So, as said, we're belonging to the United Nations, but we're also a university, which makes us very particular in this UN family. So, we're an official organization under the United Nations. As I already said, our rector, he is based in Tokyo, but you got to imagine it as a university, and each faculty can be located in a different country. So,
Yeah.
as universities have different faculties and different topics they're dealing with, so does UNU. It was founded in the 1970s as a think tank to the UN, and our institute in Bonn. We're working on, as you already said, environment and human security. So you can say we're a think tank working on topics related to climate change and disaster risk reduction with different foci. And we're doing both. We're doing research, obviously. We're also doing a lot of policy work. Well, not both, but it's three things we're doing. And the third pillar, obviously, is education. So we also run a master's program together with the local university, the University of Bonn. And it's a program called Masters in Geography of Risk and Human Security. And it's really nice because it's a very international student crowd we're having here each year.
So is it do you have a campus of United Nations University, or is it part of some other campuses?
I wish it was, and I'm talking to an Indian, right? And I love universities in your country where you have the nice campuses. No, in fact, it's not. So we're based in Germany, and usually universities in Germany, they don't have a big campus. They're rather
Mm.
built within the cities, which is also very
Okay.
nice. They're rather parts of the city and also with
Mm.
different buildings across the city. And it's the same in our students. They do have parts of their lectures in the university and parts here on the, well, it said UN campus, but in the end, we're using parts of the former government buildings from
Sure, sure.
West Germany, obviously. Before the reunification with East
Okay.
Germany, Bonn was the capital city.
And how do students apply for United Nations University if they have to?
Oh, thanks for giving me the chance to do an advertisement for our masters, which is great. Um, You just go to our website, which, well, from UNU-EHS, which is unu.edu/EHS, and there you find all the information for the master's program. The application period is usually autumn-ish, and then it's kind of a tough competition. It's a competitive process to get into it, but students from low and middle income countries also have a quite good chance to get a scholarship under the German
Okay,
academic exchange service.
sure.
And you can apply whatever studies you did as long as they're related somehow to geography, but we also have engineers, environmental engineers, planners, and so on. So as I said, it's a nice diverse crowd.
Amazing. As a leader in sustainability and urban development, could you share some of the early moments or challenges that have shaped your perspective? For example, you began with interest in architecture, but your focus shifted into understanding how cities can become more livable and sustainable for the people who live in those cities. So, would you elaborate a bit more on how this shift influenced your approach? Like, because you have a lot of diversity in your career.
And that's a nice way of putting it. Thank you. Absolutely. So I started studying architecture because I was very much into, hey, how to do buildings and how to do it in a sustainable way. And then when I studied architecture, it was a nice study program, but in the end, what you learn obviously is how to design the buildings. And well, then part of the design task we had to do was, hey, you now do a sketch for an opera house in the middle of nowhere, which is
Yes.
maybe something one out of a million architects is ever going
Right.
to
Right.
get to design. So I
Yes.
at some point figured out I'm more interested in the people and how
Yes.
cities function than in the
Right.
actual buildings. And that is how I continued on the resources management and then with a PhD in urban geography. So that was kind of one defining moment in my career when I started realizing it's more about the people living in cities and how we make it better for us to live together, how we design the open spaces, maybe even more than our own flats.
Interesting. So basically, you had a very people-driven approach. You were more interested in rather than just the built environment, but the people who live there. So systemic approach.
Absolutely, I would say so.
Yeah. Simone, your work bridges research and artistic expression. Could you share how your personal experiences led to blend these two different fields, particularly in addressing the climate change?
Right. So, on the one hand, I think what helped me a lot is this background in architecture, which very often also bridges into the more, let's say, artistic expressions, right? So, if you
Yeah.
design a building very well, it's both. It has this very practical touch because you
Hmm.
got to live in there, but you also need to be inspired by it. So, I
Yeah.
feel
Yeah.
even as a researcher, the way we disseminate our messages can also be done in a more creative way. And that is how over the last year, more creative ways of disseminating messaging and how we express ourselves and how we also try to link to the everyday life of people kind of gained more traction and became more important to me. So
Hmm.
one of the things we're, for instance, doing you see it in the background of my
Yeah.
screen here is, for instance, photography. So
Yes.
besides using methodologies that very often researchers apply, which is doing interviews or focus group discussions, we also
Hmm.
now increasingly look into more artistic ways of capturing messages from people, which can be photography.
Yes, exactly. Last time in our last discussion, you shared about a project which you're running worldwide. So could you elaborate a bit more about that? Because it's somewhere linked to what you're telling right now.
Absolutely, very happily so. Exactly. So also these photos that you see are part of a project which is called Transformative Urban Coalitions, which
Hmm.
is a 6 years project under the International Climate Initiative supported by
Yes.
the German government. And as the title already says, this is about how we bring together the people we would need to change our cities to make them more sustainable. And that is not only the politicians, of course, they're super important, but it's also citizens. It is all of us. It is local
Right.
communities. And we're looking into how can we bring them together? Of course, we do
Correct.
have elected representatives and
Hmm.
they fully take good decisions, but things are always more impactful if more people buy into it and if all the
Correct.
voices are being heard.
Yes.
And that is what we're now trying to do in 5 cities across Latin America. We're about halfway through this project. After 3 years, I
Hmm.
can say that it does take some efforts to bring local communities together and also to make them trust each other, because my
Right.
interest might be a different one from my neighbors or someone who's living 2 streets apart. But we're trying to build spaces, not build, but to provide spaces where people can meet on regular intervals and together see how they can make their community their part of the city, a
Right.
better place by, for instance, implementing something called tactical urbanism, which could be changing the appearance of a street corner to make it more pedestrian or bike friendly, or to
Right.
do children's playground and so on. But doing this under after building and after designing a common goal and a common vision for that neighborhood. And that sounds like an obvious process, but it's not. But it's very eye-opening, because in the end, even if my interest now might be a different one, you might be more looking into traffic problems. I might be looking more into greening my spaces, but we might
Right.
both be able to agree that in 30 years from now, our city should be more environmentally friendly. Children should
Exactly.
be happily playing outside, and so on. And based on that, it's then a bit easier to, in retrospect, say, if you want to reach that in 30 years, what do we need to do right now? And that can be communicated and designed more easily by touching people's emotion than just giving
Yes.
the numbers and facts.
Right, right. On that note, I'd like to share a bit of experience as part of Earth5R's community development program. We saw a lot of garbage patches in the city, in Mumbai city, particularly around lakes and river areas or even near the beaches. So one of the things I started doing was what we did was like we would get citizens coming together for doing the program, but we also had one special feature for this program, which was like getting children and people who are artistic or who are at least artistic interest. So we would say that we will first clean the area and then we do some activity, and these activity could be sometimes be sports. For example, we used to get children to play football. So our idea was that first we clean this space, we own this space, and then we play over there. So the idea was that once the community starts owning that area, when we say ownership, it is more about hanging out in that space. And then we felt that once children played football, the area was clean, more people started coming over there. And then it becomes a community space. Then people don't throw garbage over there. Or things like playing guitar, playing some music. We used to paint on the side. We would get these canvases and we would do live sketch after the cleanup. So it's a community building activity, like how tribal communities used to earlier, like gathering around the fire and dancing and doing some community activities. So that was the whole idea.
That's so inspiring. And I think
Yeah.
that's exactly it. You just nailed it. It's
Yeah.
about having someone who starts it
Yes.
and owning a space, and then others will follow. And then in the end, it is a true community effort, and it might also bring people more closely together. And we
Right.
got to do it. And it's also, I feel it's kind of the obligation of all of us to make this happen. We can't just blame
Yeah.
it on someone else. At some point, we also got to invest a bit, but it's also very rewarding because it also brings people closer together.
Yeah, exactly. Because uh, these spots, because one of the challenges of today's modern life is that people are living in silos. It's very nuclear families, small families, and they don't talk to each other. Communities don't connect with each other. So there are very high chances that these public spaces would get neglected. And when areas are neglected, they're not taken care of, then we have, if we want to become more sensitive towards our environment, we have to start being in the environment and start doing things together as a community. So
Absolutely.
mhm.
And if I may say, as our institute is looking and particularly on climate change and disaster risk reduction action, that's also just so important. I mean, we can say, hey, people gather outside and play guitar, as you just beautifully explained, but it's
Yes.
also about the garbage cleaning. It is about looking into how to make these spaces more sustainable. We might not
Right.
call it sustainable, but in the
Yeah.
end, that is what we intuitively do. And by having these stronger community ties, we already do something around sustainability. We already, this is
Yes.
the nucleus then also around climate action or reducing disaster risk by, for instance, doing the cleaning or
Yeah.
prepping an area so that it looks better and it's more green, and that in itself can be a so-called nature-based solution that
Yes.
reduces the risk of future floods or something. And the
Yes.
community ties are also super important. We saw that
Right.
during COVID.
Yeah. So during these programs, we also, since we have cleaned up, we also do plantation. So it's like a kind of a hybrid program where you clean, you also plant. So area becomes much more greener, which brings birds and butterflies and, biodiversity. So it's nature-based solution, but it's a community-driven program.
Absolutely.
You've worked with Oscar-winning filmmakers and researchers. So, what inspired you to collaborate with creative minds to communicate your message about climate change and urban transformation? Could you tell a bit more about this?
Yeah, first of all, it sounds great, right? You work with Oscar-winning filmmakers, and it certainly is. It also might sound a bit intimidating, but in this project I just mentioned, this Transformative Urban Coalitions one, we're working with Dirk Wilutzki and Mathilde Bonnefoy. So they're a German and a French filmmaker. And
Yes,
they, a couple of years back, won the Oscar for Best Documentary.
yes.
And they happen to become part of our TUC, which is the abbreviation for Transformative Urban Coalitions project. And they started capturing in short documentaries, in short films of 10 to 15 minutes, voices from international leaders on
Hmm.
urban climate action. And we then extended this to also covering voices from these communities we're working in. So
Hmm.
that we have both perspectives, the global ones from leading researchers, but also the very local one. And
Yes.
this is on the one hand to educate all of us around the challenges we're facing and
Hmm.
the threaten or the threats we will have to face if we don't do anything around climate action. But
Yes.
it's also to capture the already inspiring voices of people that are doing things. Like one of the stories is exactly around this waste picking that you just mentioned,
Yes.
just from a city in Brazil.
Hmm.
Another one is about changing the transport system, and you can see what people are able to do. And this is captured in the documentaries where you would see people sitting in front of a screen as you're doing and I'm doing right now, and there's a speak from their heart, and they tell their own journeys and stories and what would have to be done and how all the change that we as individuals and as groups and society make can then result in a global change.
Yeah, right. Is this documentary available for people to watch?
Oh, absolutely. That's a good one. I should do more advertisements around it.
Yeah,
And yes, they're all available on our project website, which is urbancoalitions.org. And
sure.
as the project is predominantly in, well, we're working with cities in Latin America. So at this point, they're available in English, but we also have the subtitles in Spanish and
Sure,
Portuguese.
sure. So we'll put a link to this
Oh, that would
podcast.
be
Yeah,
lovely.
yeah, yeah. In your work, you focus on connecting local needs with global climate action. So how do you develop this approach, and how has it evolved over the time?
So, as we said earlier, UNU is part of this UN family, and of course, there's all the international frameworks we perhaps or hopefully all have heard about. The Paris Agreement, which is around the climate action. There is a comparable framework for disaster risk reduction, which is the SENDA framework. We might all
Hmm.
know the Sustainable Development Goals and the Agenda
Yes,
2030. So there's all these global frameworks, but where they're implemented, of course,
yes.
it's on the country level. So countries have to adopt this, but
Hmm.
the real implementation starts locally. And
Hmm.
we've already been discussing over the past minutes that there's a lot of local action taking place, but maybe not all of these agendas are or even should be known in very detail locally. So our
Yes.
research exactly tries to bridge that. We're trying to look into what does it take, what can be done, and how does that then relate back to these global processes. So we're
Yes.
trying to do this both top down and a bottom up approach, and trying to really bridge that difference by also translating these global agendas and these
Hmm.
short drafts into locally suited action. And that's one of the beauties of our institute, and the work I love here very much is that well, it's great having global frameworks, but the way these agendas are implemented locally might be a bit different because
Yes.
there's different places of the world, there's different ecosystems,
Yeah,
geographies,
exactly.
there's different cultures and so on.
Yes, right. Simone, you've been involved in global projects, including those in Latin America, where you have set up urban labs. Could you tell us a bit more about the transformative urban coalitions that you have built and the impact they had on the local community? Also, we would like to discuss similar work that you have done beyond Latin America, like, for example, in your PhD research, where you compare cities in Latin America with Asia and other places, and you also analyze inhabitants, especially the younger generation. So, could you tell us a bit more about this particular area? Seems to be very interesting work.
How many hours do I have now for talking about that?
We can go on. This is because I think that
Okay.
there's a lot of inside information we're getting, which is going to be very valuable for our audience.
Right. So first of all, let's start from the urban labs, and then I'm happily also touching on all the rest. Urban labs are an approach that I think have become more popular over the last decade. It started from European and US
Hmm.
American context where it's about really setting up these coalitions. So it's not so the traditional way of doing research is me as a researcher, I go
Right.
somewhere, I collect
Right.
some data. I can collect data by interviews, by, I don't know, measuring by collecting indicator data or something, but it's more about something and not with someone. So urban
Right.
try to change that perspective by
Hmm.
really having this more co-developed approach, and
Sure.
it also having research being closer to action and policy. So that
Interesting.
mandate is also what we're doing in
Hmm.
UNU, like linking research to policy. So urban labs, I feel, are just a natural step there. So very
Yes.
concretely, what are we doing? For instance, one of our urban labs is located in a small, well, suburb or one more marginal settlement within the vicinities of Buenos Aires, which is the capital
Hmm.
city of Argentina.
Yes.
There, people have been working for quite a bit already in a so-called environmental table to look
Hmm.
into how to make their settlement more environmentally friendly. Based on
Yes.
that, we now set up an urban lab, which is a form of engagement where politicians from the urban, like from Buenos Aires city government, come together with the local inhabitants, with other NGOs, activists, for instance, also a local filmmaker, anyone who's interested capturing what's happening locally. And
Yes.
they meet and then see what can be done. Now, we as researchers joined that also with the help of locally based researchers from local universities.
Hmm.
See how we, with the data we could provide and analyze, can support that. So on the one
Yeah.
hand, in the urban lab, the job of the researcher is to bring data and to inform, because we might have an advantage here knowing what kind of data is available, how to analyze it, and so on. So that helps the further development of the lab
Yes.
and the local urban development. On the other hand, we're also collecting data there. We're collecting by participatory observation, which is basically someone
Hmm.
from our team, a local researcher, attending the meetings, looking into how has also the way people interact changed over time. And that
Yes.
is totally underestimated because it's not a direct output, but this is the most important thing, in fact, because
Right.
if we change the way people engage, maybe the next generation then already has more opportunities for being already part or having a seat at the table and not just
Right.
trying to get their voices heard and so on. So um, the urban labs, in short, they're just a way of interaction, so to
Hmm.
say. They're
Hmm.
a regular means of engagement, and we as researchers both contribute to it, but also then extract data, analyze it, and feed it back into the process.
Okay.
And that very much helps to then develop locally suited solutions for
Right.
urban development.
Yes.
And
Yes.
we've already, well, as my job as a researcher is to also publish. So me and
Hmm.
my colleagues have already done a few publications. We've been to international conferences where we brought where we brought the results from that research. We've also enabled local people from that urban labs join international conferences so that they could exchange with others. So it's
Yes.
a means of opening up other streams of communication for that
Yes.
exact urban lab to learn from others and engage with others, not only within their city, but beyond. And I feel that is extremely important, not only in Latin America, but also elsewhere. And the way we live and interact, I think, defines us also as human beings very
That's
much, but it
true.
also helps shaping our cities, as we have discussed
Correct.
earlier. And maybe that's also kind of a bridge to what I started doing back in my PhD days, where I tried to assess how would people still relate to their city, to their surroundings, and how much does that still, or is that still of value to someone? Because I studied architecture, I also studied conservation thereafter, with the understanding, with the impression that we also are defined by our feelings and values and emotions, and
Correct.
also relates back to so-called places of remembrance in city where things have happened, maybe in my country's history, in my city's
Hmm.
history, also my personal history, and that is of value to me. And as soon as something is valuable to me, it can be an open space, it can be a building, it can be what is happening in there, it can be the guitar playing people in there,
Yeah.
can also be some custom worshipping or cleaning activities. But as soon as it's of importance to me, I will be invested more and I want
Right.
to contribute more. And I think that can also be a unifying character of a community. So that's
Yeah.
what I try to compare also across different cities in different countries.
Okay. And what do you do with the data that comes? Like, I understand you do research papers and you share this information in conferences, but do you also share with policymakers for changes in policy or implementation?
Absolutely, and that touches on one of the core mandates of
Hmm.
UNU-EHS and also of me and my research team here.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying, so we're doing our very best not to hide that data, but to
Hmm.
process it in a way that it is accessible to different target audiences. And one of the
Okay.
key target audiences, of course, is fellow researchers. That
Right.
goes into the research papers, but I hope not too many high-ranking researchers are hearing this right now, but maybe not all research papers are read by many, many people. It
That's
could be
true.
read by
That's
a
true.
small community.
That's true. That is why we want to work with, academics like yourself and corporate professionals, form a working group, and you make use of this all knowledge for mobilizing the change together.
Exactly, and that I think is then super important. It's super important to think about that and to see what are other ways of disseminating the message.
Yes,
And that
right,
is for the policymakers.
right.
Very honestly, we just, for instance, recently did a super nice project where we looked into some new topic within the international
Hmm.
climate action, which is, well, you might have heard about climate adaptation and climate
Right.
mitigation.
Yes.
The third stream that is emerging is so-called loss and damage, where
Right.
it's being
Okay.
increasingly recognized that, well, losses and damages from climate-induced disasters
Hmm.
are unfortunately not unavoidable. They will happen. And how do we compensate for that? How do we now build mechanisms to do action on that? So we did a longer study, studied also cities in different countries and continents, and in particular informal settlements within these cities, because
Yes.
it's very often the people that anyway live in marginality or in informality that are suffering the most, because
Yes.
on the one hand they're living in the places that are vacant, and very often they're vacant because they're affected by floodings or
Right.
landslides or something, and they're often not part of the social security
Correct.
net.
Exactly.
So they would need support, and we looked into that and did a long report, which, don't let me lie, has something between 80 and 100 pages, which is already a policy report. It's not a
Hmm.
research paper, but on the other hand, we also got to recognize that a policymaker might be very busy. So we need to look into what is the very essence. How do we capture that in a two-pager, in a three-pager, in a
Right.
short video, in other
Like
ways?
recommendations?
Exactly,
Hmm.
exactly. There's a list of 20 recommendations out of that, which
Hmm.
is aiming even at different types of policymakers on the international, the national level, on at the NGO level, and so on. So that's
Hmm.
what we're doing, trying to translate the messages to policymakers and
Hmm.
that's by different types of outlets.
Okay. Simone, you have been part of various projects with other UN organizations such as UNDRR, which is a nature-based solution for risk reduction, and UNCCD, which is urban land restoration. So working towards where you've been working towards achieving global frameworks like Paris Agreement and Sendai framework. So how did you transition into these international roles, and what were some of the significant milestones that led you to involvement in these large-scale efforts?
Right. So, yeah, as a UNU's mandate is also to support and work with other UN organizations, and
Hmm.
there's just so many. So there's a lot of acronyms around there, right? And we might
Yeah.
know UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework for Climate Change.
Yeah.
And there's the sister institute working on disaster risk reduction, which is
Right.
UNDR, the colleagues working on against desertification, UNCCD. I won't name them all, that lasts half an hour perhaps. But we're working with them to do research and policy on climate action and risk reduction, as said.
Hmm.
And for instance, I think one of the key defining moments for me, and that was even before I was working with UNU, but I was working with a German university.
Hmm.
We partnered with UNEP, which is the UN's organization working on the environmental protection.
Right.
We started working on so-called ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. So
Hmm.
using the power of nature to reduce disaster risk by reforestation, by
Yes.
looking into retention areas to reduce flooding and so on. And we started doing a master's module. So we
Hmm.
started putting together teaching materials with colleagues from other universities. I think it was like 15, 18 universities worldwide. And it was so beautiful sharing the expertise and making it more than the sum of its pieces. So you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
putting together the materials that became open source for anyone using it worldwide. You can still use it. Any lecturer worldwide can still take that. And just, I think it was last week, my former colleague who led on the initiative told me that with a subsequent MOOC, like a massive open online course on that exact topic, we've now reached the 100,000 students, which is
Wow.
amazing.
That's amazing.
So that was great. And that was one defining moment. And I think with that, I also learned that I can make a bit of a change. I can be part of that change, even if I
Correct.
was like a younger lecturer in a German university, like
Yeah.
joining that family of actors and then people from other fellow universities, fellow researchers that then contributed. And then at some point, I got the chance and the job offer for being part of the UN University. I joined,
Which year
and
was that? Which year was that?
oh, that's a long time ago already. I just recently got to know that it's already like 7 or 8 years I'm with
Okay.
UNU. And
Okay.
even within UNU, it was a journey, right? I started
Yeah.
after the PhD, and then after a couple of years, I got offered that I'm now supposed to build a team working on cities and
Yes.
emphasizing the urban research within UNU, because we know
Hmm.
more than half of the world is urban, so that
Right.
was kind of there, but not that prominently. So we made it more prominent, and that's amazing. And it was a step-by-step thing, but I always got encouraged by my fellow colleagues here, but also by seeing the demand in other UN organizations in
Yes.
collaboration, where
Hmm.
you said earlier with the UNCCD that you already said urban land restoration. That's one of
Yeah.
the more recent topics we're working on, looking together with UNCCD into a new module, into new teaching materials on urban land restoration to feed this back into architects and urban planners education. Because again,
Hmm.
they might be knowing how to build something, but
Correct.
how to make nature and restoring nature an integral part of their work.
Correct. 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 Simon, could you share insights into more recent work on the loss and damage debate? We just spoke about it under UNFCCC,
Mhm.
especially with the establishment of the new global fund. And how can we support marginalized urban communities and provide them with access to much needed resources, particularly as the new funding schemes are being developed?
Exactly. So we already touched on it very briefly that the loss and
Hmm.
damage topic is now increasingly being discussed. Well, it has been on the agenda, I think, since 2003 when it was first mentioned in one of the international climate conferences. And just in last year in the COP, so the Conference of the Party of the Paris Agreement, the so-called Loss and Damage Fund, which was established a bit earlier, it got filled for the first time. So countries pledged money, knowing that there will be losses and damages, and that we need to particularly help the most vulnerable countries that are suffering from climate change already today more than others. So on the one hand, it is great, and I think it's a great global initiative having that, and that's a big achievement already. But always, even if there's a lot of resources, it will not be enough to cover each and everything. So we need to look into the exact mechanisms, how to disperse these fundings and how to do that. And there's obviously super knowledgeable people from the finance community that are right now looking into that. And we also have fellow colleagues at our institute that are very much into this question of climate finance that are contributing to that. I'm touching this from this more urban perspective because, as I already said, and that's like many people would know that soon there will be even 2/3 of the world population living in cities, and there's also migration to cities from other places that might be hit by disasters. So we need to prepare cities for that futures and for these scenarios. And the loss and damage topic can be a very important one here. And the work we're doing, that we did, starting with 2 studies we now completed, and that will be published in a couple of weeks from now. We looked into what are the impacts people living in urban informality are facing already now from disasters. What are the existing mechanisms to support them before, during, and after disasters? And how can we capitalize on these measures, but also on already existing data and assessments to get them support from this loss and damage fund in the future, and how to make it actionable. So these are the exact recommendations we have been talking about a bit earlier. And one of the central recommendations is to look into also the data that does exist, which is very often going beyond the formal census or the formal data collection. But these communities might already know very well what is happening. It's just a blank spot on many maps because they're beyond the formal systems.
That's true. That's true. So interesting that you're looking at you're basically connecting the dots as well.
Exactly, and it's that exact local knowledge, right? So we hear a lot internationally also about indigenous knowledge, local knowledge in cities, perhaps more this local knowledge, and that is super relevant. And that again is a bridge back to the international context. So we're recording this podcast shortly after the UN summit in New York, after the Summit of the Future, where that exact local knowledge has been quite prominently in the final declaration and in the Pact Future.
On that note, which is the reason that the Earth5R app has modules that so we believe that the change should come from local level. I mean, problem is global, but it's all local as well. So, which is the reason that people take charge of the locality by using the app and going out of their houses and creating data points, whether it's regarding total number of trees in the locality or waste hotspots or noise pollution in their local area or water pollution in their local area, or data about whether is there a play area for children in their buildings where they live, or is there bicycle parking areas in the building, or what is the green space in the area, or the areas for people to sit together, because that's another challenge, that large urban cities are just giving spaces for car parking or just for the residential purpose, but there's no space for people to come together and sit in the area because that's builds the community. So people are collecting this kind of data, and we believe that local information and the local data plays a very, very vital role. And otherwise, we will never know that was the ground reality.
Absolutely, and that data is it's more than these people might even think right now, and
Yeah.
it's extremely valuable. So on the one hand, it might close very crucial data gaps, but it's also, now speaking from my perspective as a also a researcher on disaster risk reduction, knowing where people would gather
Hmm.
is super vital also during and after a disaster, because these could be meeting points. These can be points where you then provide relief and recovery or just disperse something. So it is very often that exact data can be used in multiple ways. We just need to then establish the systems that allow for doing so. And this
Yes,
citizen
yes.
and crowdsourced data is so vital.
Yeah, exactly. Also having a data of people, like for example, if there's a disaster or something like that, we just need to send one message via our app, and that message reaches to, across the country or across geographies to these citizen leaders who have their own community. So, disaster management can be very rapid.
You're so true, and they're very often these local leaders might even be more trusted, right? They're the
Correct.
go-to points.
Yeah, yeah. Simon, you worked on creating urban labs. What has been the most rewarding aspect of empowering local communities or talking about it through these initiatives? And can you share a specific success story?
All right, so there's different ways this is very rewarding for me as a person.
Yeah,
But besides all the research merits and so on, the most rewarding one is just seeing that it's being successful locally and that we can create an impact and a change locally and can contribute to create a better living for these people very, very locally, and that they might also trust us that we're coming there for good. Because I think one of the, let's say, habits of global research to overcome is that maybe researchers from one country go to another one, they collect data, they leave and never come back, and that data is published somewhere, but the communities locally don't have any benefit out of that. That's
correct.
exactly what we're trying not to do. And so I think I'm getting my rewards and being like totally compensated for whatever extra hours we're working here from seeing that we can really make a difference locally, but also hopefully then in the recommendations we might give on a larger scale nationally. One of the very concrete examples, for instance, going back to the Buenos Aires case study that I mentioned earlier, is that the colleagues from that informal settlement, supported by local researchers from our colleagues from IIED, America Latina, they now applied for different or for awards
Hmm.
with the local. And again, we're touching on the artistic expression with murals they have painted to educate children and others on environmental behavior. They won a prize and got international recognition for it. So it's like an
Wow.
international award they got for it. And that, just knowing that we contributed a little bit to that,
Yes.
they could have done without us, but maybe we've helped a little bit. That's
Hmm.
just so nice to know.
Yeah, that is really amazing. And it's a nice story and a nice example of community in action and bridging these
Yes.
gaps.
And last year, if I may say, we took two people, two colleagues from that part, from the event, one local community leader and one
From
colleague
Argentina?
from Argentina, yes.
Yeah.
One community leader there and one colleague, she was working for the city government. We
Hmm.
took them to the climate conference to
Okay.
Dubai. We had
Yeah.
the chance to do so, and we learned it's so much more impactful if they share their own stories instead of
Correct.
me translating their story to someone else and seeing them
Yes.
connect to people from other countries, including India, for example,
Hmm.
to see that the challenges they're facing,
Yeah.
even if coming from completely different world regions and being raised in different cultures, the challenges are comparable. So why not finding joint solutions by also connecting? So seeing them thriving there and really telling super powerful stories, that was also very rewarding.
On that note, I'd like to share one story as we were doing in the early days of Earth5R when we started. We wanted to clean the local area. We believe that the area has to look clean and it is our ecosystem. Mumbai has a lot of slums apart from high-rise buildings. So what happened is that I was passing through this slum area nearby, and we were talking to the local people, families, women standing outside, and they didn't have work, because in slum there are a lot of people who don't have any jobs or any work. And we started talking to them about the waste, and we said that there's a lot of cloth waste lying over here, and why don't you keep it clean? And they said that I have seen you guys going to the lake nearby and doing the cleanups, and everybody taking selfies after the cleanup. But tell me that how does it help us, or how this cleaning is going to help me? Because for me, the thing that I care about is whether I'll have food tonight or not. And that was an eye-opening thing because, you know, it's a Maslow's hierarchy of need that we tend to look at things from our lens. And if we have the power or influence, or we are part of the system where policies are designed by that particular section of the society or that part of the pyramid, then kind of policies that we are making may not be right for everyone. So that is why it is very, very important for us. And eventually we started working, and I understood that livelihood is a real issue. And then we figured out a circular economy model where we started converting waste into products, and we developed a circular economy social entrepreneurship program for this entire community, which was a success for us. But yes, it is very easy to get blinded and think that what we're doing is right and is good and it's good for everyone. So I think that your approach was amazing.
Yeah, I think you're touching on a super important topic, and it's we need to see what are people's exact needs and demands, and sometimes we might tend to overlook because we're looking at things from our own perspective. And when if I may share another story, I recall when I did parts of my PhD work in Nepal because well, I
Hmm.
was for uh, reasons. I think it was one of my lecturers. She was working for an NGO there, so I got pulled into that. And then at some point was discussing with a local colleague in Kathmandu around implementing nature-based solutions there because, of course, they're facing a huge risk from earthquakes, but also from flooding and landslides and so on. And that was in the very early days of nature-based solutions. Now they're all over the place.
Right.
They're like fashion. They're not debatable. That they do make
Hmm.
sense. But at that time, we still needed to convince a lot the engineers in particular that this does make sense and that maybe instead of a dam we can do something else. And that colleague in Kathmandu, and that was my eye opener. He told me like, yeah, but are you just trying to sell me something which you would never apply there in Germany or elsewhere or in Europe? Have you seen Queen Elizabeth doing rice paddy in front of the Buckingham Palace? I was like, no, not really. And then that stuck with me that we need to see what is not only the local realities, but what is also acceptable or found useful, or whatever you might be believing does make sense for you at a certain point, in a certain time, in a certain place. And but that also on occasion successful examples from other world regions are very important. So you need these change makers, you need the successful examples. Also, for instance, here in this case for the nature-based solutions, to the best of my knowledge, there's no rice paddies in front of the Buckingham Palace until today. But other cities have become front runners so that
Yeah, right.
then city B can learn from city A, and that transcends also countries and continents, and that goes then also down to the local communities that are doing it.
Yeah. Simone, your work involves scientific analysis alongside the community-driven effort. So how do you balance the two elements? Like what kind of impact do you believe this dual approach has on urban environment? So scientific analysis along with community-driven efforts. So
To me, it's not even a difference anymore, and that I believe touches on different ways of doing research. So when we think about research, we still think a lot about this primary research. Like I'm reading the books, I'm collecting some data, but
Yeah.
there's also other ways of doing research which can be very much action related. So action research or participatory research, where you even look into crowdsourced data, as you're doing with Earth5R as well. Or looking into action research and local community-led research. For instance, in the cities our TOOC project is working in Brazil, we in last year did a community-based enumeration because they're not part of the formal census. So without any data, how can you make a pledge to the city government that you're in need of something if you can't prove it? And it was not us going there collecting the data, but it was us working together with the communities, training enumerators from the communities and the local university that then collected it. So that knowledge stays with that community. So I think that also touches back on the question, what is research knowledge, what is local knowledge, what is indigenous knowledge? And that's a very valid approach to blur the lines between that, because it might be a very colonial Western or old-fashioned thinking that one type of knowledge is more valuable than the other one. It's not.
Or valuable.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not more valuable than the other. It's all very valuable types of bodies of knowledge.
Exactly.
They're
Yeah.
not even separate necessarily, only because I do collect that data and not someone from the community. Why should it be better?
Yeah. Yeah. One of my thought process has also been while developing the data-driven model at Earth5R, or at least a technology, was that I have particularly seen most of the product developers or most of the engineers or scientists doing work in the lab, in the silos, developing products, services for the people who are living in diverse conditions. And a lot of them, they don't even visit or they don't even know their audience. So what happens that you end up making something that is literally imposed on those people and may not be fit for them or for doesn't solve their problem. So that's also very important from the point that you're currently discussing. That's extremely important to hear their voices, work with them, know, and having local labs or local partners so that you get a more balanced information about the reality.
Absolutely. I think ground truthing research outputs by
Hmm.
looking into what is really needed is extremely important. On the other hand, researchers, I feel, can contribute by having a broader perspective and maybe also bringing in
Yes,
learnings from somewhere else that you can't impose on the community. You can't expect everyone to know everything. So we just
right.
need to join forces here.
Yeah. And a lot of time communities know actually more than us about certain subjects.
I totally agree.
Yeah. You've helped set up urban labs across Latin American cities. What challenges did you face when trying to implement sustainable solution in these regions? Because these are very, very, like these are the regions where there are certain practices, certain ways of doing things, governments function certain way. So there's always a way of doing things. So, and how did you overcome those challenges?
Um, I think it all comes down very much to building trust. So it sounds very easy and maybe not so obvious, but in the end, if we want to build a better future for everyone, might sound too cheesy right now. Let's say we want to implement more sustainable solutions in urban planning and also urban governance. You need to make people work together. And why should they trust me as a researcher who's now coming with a project of X number of years that I can contribute to that change, or that the local
Hmm.
partners we're working with can contribute to that? So to build lasting solutions, we need all hands on deck, but that requires people working together. And that again
Right.
requires the trust of doing so. So one of the key challenges for me was and is that we need to factor in these trust building processes also in project cycles. And that sounds easier than it actually is, because we might all be more into let's work on the exact solution. Here's a technical measure we need to implement right now. And it on paper also looks very excellent that we may save time if we just bring that expert who does that implementation. For some projects, I don't know, where it's commonly agreed that we need to build this exact street or need to do that exact house might be true, or that exact open space. But in reality, we can build better approaches and better cities if we would consider the multiple benefits, for instance, an open space would provide. Yes, of course, it can serve as a children's playground, but maybe it's also a gathering point in a disaster. It might benefit from some greenery. It might be better located in a slightly different place because then more people could have access. So, but that requires a joint decision-making process. And for that, you need to have the buy-in and the long-term trust and also ways of working together. And that designing that and having people believe that it's worth it, that to me was a key challenge here.
So how do you win the trust?
By being very open,
Mm,
by being very transparent, by asking in the first place what is the exact demand and not telling them what I think their demand is.
So basically you're co-developing.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah.
co-development. You're right.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's amazing. You utilized filmmaking, photography, and urban labs to drive your message. Basically, in nutshell, what we are coming to is like it's a very well designed system and approach. So what led you to use these out of the box methods, and how do you believe they have changed the way people engage with sustainability issues?
Again, it comes back to the co-development. So
Mm,
that urban lab process is nothing but trying to formalize a joint decision-making process. And if we believe in the implementation of all these global frameworks we've been talking about a little earlier, and that our nature, well, in the end, our planet, all the common goods are actually common goods that we all should benefit and thrive
yes.
from. It comes down to the joint decision processes also on the very local level. I'm not saying that does not exist. There's super fabulous approaches where participatory decision making is already implemented in many countries and cities worldwide. It's, for instance, Brazil has been a front runner in participatory budgeting, where parts of the public budget was decided over in a participatory way, where different citizens were selected to co-decide over that, and that brought along across different projects than maybe only politicians alone would have decided on. But we're not yet fully there. So these urban labs, which would also include researchers and bring in their abilities and then skills, I believe can make a difference here.
Nice. Simone, you've built partnership with organizations like Paris Committee and capacity building under UNFCCC and the Global Innovation Hub. So could you tell a bit more that how were you able to foster these partnerships, and is there any particular skill that people can learn or audience can learn? Because working with these different diverse parties, especially these are they have their own ways of working. So how did you build these partnerships?
Each organization has their own way of working, and maybe one of the outcomes of this podcast should also be that it is way less scary and way more hands-on than it might sound on paper. So
Right.
there is access to these processes, and
Mm,
for instance, you touched on the PCCB, which is the Paris Committee for Capacity Building, which is under the UN climate action. They're doing a fabulous job having regular podcasts,
mm,
trainings, a lot of international organizations down to local NGOs that are partners of theirs. So we've been partnering with them for a couple of years right now, including for the COPs, or the International Climate Conferences, where we have contributed with these exact photo exhibitions that you see in
yes.
my background,
Yes.
some of it, and to educate also people going to these conferences
Mm,
with the work we're doing, so that international policymakers are reminded of what is happening locally and what still has to happen locally. But
yes.
also as a normal citizen, as someone who's interested, you can join these trainings, you can join the webinars, you get access to that information, and
Hmm.
um, you can also partner with them. So I
Hmm.
just last week attended a workshop under the PCCB together with TED and US universities, where young leaders were brought together and they were sharing really amazing stories. And it was so inspiring how different people in there, I don't know, some even down to teenagers, can make a difference by
Yeah.
inventing and implementing local initiatives that made
Yeah.
their cities better places.
Yeah. 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 What are some of the important lessons that you have learned during this process, like throughout your career, doing partnerships, doing the labs, and different kind of artistic approaches that you had? So important lessons that people can learn from.
Maybe I can share two lessons. One is that we all, well, everyone who's into this sustainability, everyone who thinks we need to change some of the ways
Hmm.
we're living, working, acting right now, that we all might have our own way of contributing. So I'm
Yeah.
contributing as a researcher, maybe a bit as someone who's trying to also translate that to policy making. And I'm doing
Right.
it in this urban research. Someone else might do it as a local community leader. Someone might go into local politics or something, but we can, with all our means, using our own abilities and then skills, contribute to that change. And that's one lesson. And the other one is that it takes all of us for doing so. So, when I was studying architecture, the architects didn't like the civil engineers, and the civil engineers
Yeah.
didn't like the architects, but only together can build a proper house. So,
Correct.
I'm trained like that. In my university days, it takes
Hmm.
some time to overcome that thinking. And we might have the
Hmm.
same between other silos, between different nationalities, or even, I don't know, different ministries in a country. So that it's so important to overcome that. That's the other lesson I have learned.
So understanding and collaborations together.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Uh, Simon, we have a very large audience of people, particularly college students, who are looking forward to building their career into climate space. And also, we have a lot of people who are in corporate jobs, who are, in different departments, but they're building their career into sustainability because it's a growing sector, and also people care about the cause. So for these kind of people, uh, especially those who are looking at working at the intersection of research, policy, and creative communication, which is your field, what advice would you give them in terms of skills or things that they should develop?
Um, I would start from saying, don't be scared that this might be a too broad, it might look like a too broad topic in the beginning, right?
Yes, yes.
And maybe based on my own development, I started from architecture, and then I kind of continuously evolved
Hmm.
and further developed my skills. So um, don't be scared. So start from somewhere, and then whenever some opportunity arises, take it, and also try to dare. Be daring, and try to trust yourself that you're able of delivering it. Maybe that's also a bit of a gendered thing here, that as a female you're not necessarily educated in such a way that you're bold and take your perspective and that you speak your mind, but it definitely you can trust yourself more than you might think in the very beginning. And
Yeah.
of course, we all face some challenges once in a while, but they might also make us stronger.
Yeah. Any particular resources or ways of finding mentors or any kind of other those kind of ideas?
Finding mentors is definitely great, but that does not necessarily mean it has to be someone elderly or your professor or something. If it's
Hmm.
like that, that's amazing.
Hmm.
But just the power of even some youngsters doing something together can be quite strong. And of course, now with
Hmm.
media and the means to engage also with fellow
Yes.
people in other countries and continents, and so that might be quite helpful. There's a lot of international organizations or youth networks or networks of people sharing a certain interest that is definitely also quite useful. Yeah, and then maybe also looking into the power of doing some or looking into doing some trainings. And there's so many available online
Yes.
nowadays. So
Right.
that's also
Right.
certainly a huge benefit.
Hmm. You mentioned that it's important not to reinvent the wheel, but to learn from others. What are the key pieces of knowledge you think young professionals should focus to shorten their learning curve so that they save time, be rapid and fast, which is what they want, and be more impactful?
Well, obviously, look into what is already there. I mean, that's a
Yes.
very researcher perspective, right? Reinventing the wheel is never necessarily good. So look into what does already exist. Now that
Hmm.
with the internet and all the global data might also be quite challenging, but I
Yeah.
think that it might also help us to just get an understanding if a certain approach, like for
Hmm.
instance, you really want to change your community, you want to change the garbage system locally or something, look into that. It has already been there. You want to do research on a certain topic. I'm I mean, it's part of my research process to look what has already been published around it. So that definitely shortens the learning curve. It might be good asking someone who's a bit more senior, how have you been doing it? How would you do it? Also got to say, maybe ask someone if you're in like your early career stages or still studying, ask someone who already went through that. Ask someone who
Hmm.
already did this,
Yes.
did the thesis work you're supposed to do, not to replicate the exact same, but just to get some learnings how to do or not do things. While at the same time, I do believe we all need to have the opportunity to do our own mistakes and also sometimes learn from failures. Sometimes that's
Yeah.
even more powerful than learning from the successes.
I agree. I agree with that. I mean, all of us have whatever we have achieved, we had a fair share of failures as well. And I think that's where the biggest learnings have happened.
We even recently, I don't even recall exactly when, but we recently discussed that we should be more open sharing also the failures, because if
Yeah,
you as an early career person see the CV of someone else, it always sounds so polished and great, right? If
yeah,
we would be honest, it wouldn't be like that. Sometimes it was a lucky occasion,
yeah.
sometimes it was a
Would you
coincidence.
like to share any of your failures? Would you want that?
Oh, my failures. Oh, there's so many. I've definitely, I could have definitely been quicker in some of my studies. Maybe on occasions I went a semester extra because where there was something where I wasn't still fully confident about, or did too many part-time jobs to finance my studies or so. That's not necessarily a failure. What's a big one? There was this one time. As a researcher, you're supposed to also write project proposals, right? And
Yeah,
sometimes they're very time sensitive because you have a certain deadline.
yeah,
There was this one time where we have been working on a proposal for a long, long, long time, and we're supposed to submit it, and the deadline was like midnight and was an online thing. And of course, everything went wrong. The Wi-Fi failed for a minute and so on. And it was a second after midnight and it wasn't yet uploaded.
yeah,
It was like, oopsie, do I dare telling my professor the next day? And then, fortunately, my colleague and I, we had already started the process. So the next day we could call the agency who was handling it, and they saw it and they have let us still submit it. This could have gone easily wrong. So there was a key learning from me. Always have some buffer time here.
yeah. My own like learning has always been that always have three backups or be triple sure because whenever there's a deadline, whenever your reputation is on the line, whatever can go wrong will go wrong.
Oh, yes, 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 absolutely. Definitely.
Simone, given your experience in working with different type of stakeholders and diverse kind of people, What are the most critical quality future climate leaders should cultivate to develop in terms of quality, not skills?
Qualities. Perseverance. And I think you need to have the ability of not being frustrated easily, because it's not a one-time thing. It takes a long time to change that. So I think that's one of the key challenges of climate action, that, you know, we as humans are our abilities to detect an immediate change is way better developed than the long-term change. And that, I think, is
Right.
something people in climate action are suffering from, that it's also on a country scale, it's perhaps easier to allocate the funds to reverse impacts of a flash flood or an earthquake or something, than saying we now need to do something about things that will only become visible in a few decades from now. So it's frustrating on occasions, and I can imagine it might be even more frustrating if you're a young climate activist who really wants to make the change, because obviously you still want to live in a place that is good for living in there for the next decades to come. So abilities is to have that frustration tolerance, but also to be able to network, to find people who are
Yeah.
interested in contributing to that. They might not always share the exact same opinion, but you might
Right.
be able to agree on the long-term goal. So also being able to build these kind of coalition, but to also compromise.
Right. Interesting. Simone, for those inspired by your journey to both research and creative climate action, what are the resources, where it can be books or documentaries or people, would you recommend to help them dive deeper into climate action and urban sustainability?
So in terms of resources, obviously there is so much. I can encourage them to listen to your podcast, obviously.
Yeah, we got very interesting guests.
Love it. No, it's really nice. But there's more of this, right? And there is a growing number of such media and then outlets. I could also promote the films we have been doing under our
Yes.
TOOK project. There's, for instance, some with Deborah Roberts, who's a leading South African, well, policymaker, but also researcher. So
Okay.
she transcends that. And she's
Hmm.
also part of IPCC, which are like the International Plan on Climate Change. And she talked about so-called boundary people in that one documentary she did with
Hmm.
us. That she said it takes exactly these people that are able to navigate the worlds between research and policy making. So, and hearing the stories of such people, but also there's the so-called climate champions initiative under UNFCCC, where people like her, not her exactly, but others that have been working in this more global context, share their stories and become inspiring leaders of climate action, and try to also encourage others to do that. So these are maybe some resources to look after. There's definitely too many books out there, so that I don't want to pick one exact one. But what I love doing is reading a mix of more factual books or publications where you
Okay.
see that this is inspiring, but also looking into novels or even crime stories, because over the last years I saw a growing number of like super cool books that were looking into climate action as well, and trying to tell the stories in a different way, so that everyday people and like normal audiences can also get
Hmm.
inspired from that.
You have a very creative take because most of the people only talk about this documentary, this book.
No, I'm not going to do that. You're not getting this one book recommendation from me. I mean, there's all the usual suspects. What recently inspired me, and I should have looked up the exact book name, was a book where the author was talking on about how can we foster climate action, and he said we need to make, because he said that humans, when we're telling us how to start, humans go better when with stories than with facts. I
Correct.
believe that.
Totally.
That one of the challenges of engaging people or getting people more into climate action is telling an inspiring story. And he concluded that we need to make the climate action like the hero of the story, not just the object of the story. And that
Correct.
would be a
Correct.
way of changing the approach. And that inspired me massively, that it's not the human who saves the planet who's the hero, but it's the climate action per se. And then we all can
Correct.
become like little heroes under that because we
Yeah.
contribute to that one.
Yes. Yes. It's a bigger story than just,
Absolutely.
yeah. Yeah. Simon, it was really amazing talking to you. We had some very deep perspective towards your work and United Nations University. And I also learned because one of the reasons why I'm doing podcasts is not just for others, but also myself, my team also. We learn a lot and it does influence the way we work and the things that we do. So thank you so much for sharing a lot of internet information, a lot of interesting information about how these systems work, how you do your projects in diverse regions of the world, and different styles of working and different skills that people can develop. So thank you so much, and we look forward to interacting with you in the future again in other meetings, other podcasts, as well as in some of the working groups.
It's been my huge pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.